Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Tribal Chairman Jamie Azure joined other tribal leaders from across the country in testifying on Capitol Hill today on the challenges they face with the influx of fentanyl on their reservation. Azure testifying before the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs on how his tribe formed its own drug enforcement division this year to combat the flow of drugs into the region. The chairman discussing how drug traffickers strategize where they go to sell to victims. He pushed lawmakers to help leaders in Indian country cut down on red tape barriers. Azure pointing out that it's not just Indian reservations, but also small towns in general across America that need help.
It needs to be a joint partnership of everybody working together and taking down that bureaucracy and taking that red tape down and figuring out a way of how are we going to protect that next generation, not only tribes, but the citizens of this great country.
North Dakota Senator John Hoeven, as well as Montana Senators John Tester and Steve Daines, also took part in the hearing. We'll have a link to the full hearing and reading of Chairman Azure's testimony on the committee on the Indian Affairs website.